All right, so welcome back to the next episode of my NHL Deep Dive series. This episode, we are talking about the Pittsburgh Penguins. And for me, I was kind of surprised Pittsburgh was this high, honestly. And I know they're my rankings, but the overall team rankings are based on the accumulation of the scores that the players give. So like each, if you guys haven't seen my full breakdown, it's on Instagram, on NBA Hockey. Go follow my Instagram. It's linked down below. There's the plug for today's video. And basically I take each letter grade is given like a point, like a specific amount of points, and then those points get added up with some other math involved to create the overall team rankings. So going into this, I don't know if I'd actually have Pittsburgh at, I think it's 14th right now, which seems high, but again, I think we're talking about a team that last season their underlying numbers were a lot better than their actual record showed. And I do expect them to kind of regress back to the mean a little bit in that sense, where they put up pretty good underlying numbers for most of the season. Their shooting percentage was pretty low for a lot of the year, and they ended up being kind of one of those bubble teams in the East. Um, I expect them to kind of be in that same grouping of Eastern Conference teams. Like we've seen a lot of Eastern Conference teams lately in my rankings. I think there's a reason for that. I think there's gonna be a very big dogfight for that those last two wildcard spots. But I feel like Pittsburgh's underlying numbers are going to, or their main numbers are going to kind of match up with what their underlyings have been. Even the last couple of years, this team's always been a pretty decent expected goals team. So that's kind of why they probably end up where they are. But we'll talk about that more as we dive into the actual roster. First of all, let's talk about the offseason because it was kind of an interesting offseason for them. They bring in Kevin Hayes, Anthony Beauvillier, Blake Lizotte, and Rutger McGroarty. They lose Jansen Harkins, Riley Smith, and Jeff Carter. So outside of Riley Smith, who didn't really seem to fit the way that this team wanted him to last season, and they replaced him with Kevin Hayes, who's a similar level of player. I think this team did get better. I have them at slightly upgraded because we don't know what Rucker McGroarty is going to look like this season. But even aside from that, right? Kevin Hayes and Riley Smith are kind of a wash, and then I'd say Pavilion and Lizotte are better than Harkins and Jeff Carter. So they get the slightly upgraded for that. And obviously, Rucker McGroarty is kind of the big X factor here. If he pops off and fits into that top six, then this group is significantly upgraded. But he's kind of the question mark right now. Obviously, we haven't seen him play. He played his prospect game. Like it was yesterday as I'm recording this. He got a goal and an assist. So he looked good in that. Other than that, like I think this group is good. I still believe in Anthony Beauvillier. He had a ton of potential of the Islanders. Kind of hasn't been able to figure it out since he left New York. Um, but maybe in a bottom six role, somebody can get some untapped potential out of him. Same with Blake Lizotte. He's somebody that just feels like a bottom six forward at this point. So does Beauvillier. But maybe there's some untapped secondary scoring ability there with both those guys that might be able to get. Mike Sullivan might be able to get something out of this season. Defensively, I think this group upgraded. They added Sebastian Aho, the defenseman Sebastian Aho, and then Matt Grzelcyk for P.O. Joseph. I like Matt Grzelcyk. I think he's a very good like depth defensive defenseman kind of guy who can play in like your bottom pair. Maybe fully upgraded is a little bit much for this team, but I think that they're like, if at worst it's slightly upgraded. I think Grzelcyk's better than P.O. Joseph enough, and then Sebastian Aho is a decent enough depth addition for this team that seems to be fine. And then net they didn't really do much. They didn't do anything at all in net. So overall, I think it was a fine offseason for Cal Dubas' second stint or second season in Pittsburgh. And obviously he doesn't have the flexibility cap wise to do anything crazy, but I feel like they got to be pretty happy with the overall outlook of where Pittsburgh is based on what they want to be this season. Moving to the forwards, the conversation starts with Sidney Crosby, who's just ageless at this point. Like he's still one of the 15 best players in the NHL. I have him as an A. Obviously, is in that second tier. You can't put him in the McDavid tier anymore. But he's still one of those elite, like top end centers in hockey, and there's really not much to say about Sidney Crosby. I'll kind of know what he is at this point. Evgeny Malkin's the interesting one. I still have him as a B plus. Some people might think that's too high. I don't think I'm going to get too many arguments about him being higher than that, but he still has flashes of looking like a top end center. And again, these aren't projections. So like I don't think he'll be a B plus at the end of the season. He might even slip to like a B minus by the end of the year. But I think there's still enough juice left in Evgeny Malkin to warrant being in that tier. But again, he's probably in the lower end of the B pluses if I had to like rank all the players in that tier. And Rickard Rakell, who I didn't like the trade at the time. I didn't think he showed a whole lot in Anaheim, but the couple years that he's had in Pittsburgh, like he's really fit in well into that top six. He's had good chemistry with everybody he's played with. He really has developed into a top six winger, and he, I guess it was more the lack of supporting cast in Anaheim that kind of held him back. But now that he's been given a very, I was going to say competent center, but like a very good to elite center, we've really seen Rickard Raquel kind of find that next level to his game, and I think that's very important. And that's something that I'd be interested to see if like a Rucker McGroarty can find. Obviously, we haven't seen what his first gear is yet, but playing with, even if he does end up playing with Malkin, or even if he plays with Kevin Hayes, honestly, on the third line, I still think you're going to get like he's going to get a pretty good opportunity to play with a very good center to start his career. Obviously, Sidney Crosby would be the ideal fit. I don't know if he gets onto that line right away because I really like Brian Rust on that line. So it'll be interesting. And obviously, this team doesn't have Jake Gensel anymore. That's kind of the big hole. And that's a lot to ask for a Michael Bunting and Rucker McGroarty to kind of fill on this team. And I guess that's kind of the big thing for me with this roster is like outside of Sidney Crosby, this top six lacks that dynamic like top six forward. They have a bunch of really good supporting cast guys, but they don't have that secondary killer that they've had for so long, right? Like Evgeny Malkin was always that other guy that can go, right? You look at the other big cup teams, right? You had like Kane and Taves in Chicago. Um, obviously you had Crosby and Malkin in their prime, right? Like Datsuk and Zetterberg in Detroit back in the day. It, Pittsburgh doesn't really have that anymore. Um, and the hope is that maybe Michael Bunting, in a full season here can find chemistry with somebody. Hopefully a Rucker McGroarty can become that. That seems to be that's obviously the end game for this team. And I think that might be the issue here. Obviously, Evgeny Malkin, maybe he can have a bounce back season. But other than that, like the depth on this team is good. The bottom six I really like. I really like the Kevin Hayes edition. Obviously, they got a pick out of it, take on the salary, which is a good piece of business. Kevin Hayes is still a very good player. He's overpaid, but he's still a very solid player. Anthony Beauvillier, obviously, Drew O'Connor is somebody that I like. Lars Eller as their 4C again is one of the better fourth line centers in the NHL. Um, it it really is just a good bottom six. Like there's not a lot of holes here. I think they have the secondary scoring. They have kind of the guys who can find that level. Obviously Blake Lizotte, who's not listed here right now, but he's another guy that I talked about earlier that might be able, that he'll probably step in the lineup every once in a while and find a role as well. So overall, like it, we've had over the last couple of videos, my biggest concern with a lot of these teams has been the depth scoring. I don't really have that concern with the Penguins, especially with somebody like a Kevin Hayes on your third line. My bigger concern is just who's the next best option outside of Crosby on this team, right? And I think that's kind of the big question because even a guy like Rickard Rakell don't think's good enough to lead his own line. I think he's a very good complementary player with Crosby. Same with Brian Rust, right? Like I guess the question is like a Rucker McGroarty, and that's a big ask to put on a rookie that you just picked up in a trade. So we'll see. I mean, that's kind of I think that's the thing that's going to hold this offense back a little bit. Obviously, I have them tied for 12th. I think they have really good depth. They're really well rounded, but they just lack that next guy. And it was Jake Gensel the last couple of years. He's been the second best Penguin for the last 2 or 3 years with the Malkin injuries and decline and everything that's been going on with him. So to lose him, it does hurt, I think, the ceiling for this Penguins offense. I don't think they get into the top 10 by the end of the year unless they trade for somebody. And I really don't see this team, dealing from a position of power, even if they are buyers at, something like the trade deadline. They don't have a ton of assets. Their prospect pool isn't great. They don't have a ton of like movable contracts that they'd have to ship out. Michael Bunting seems like the one that has already been moved out once. So that's kind of my biggest concern. Again, like I like the depth. I think it's very good. Um, Especially down the middle. The center core is very solid, especially if you can get a healthy Evgeny Malkin. And it's just that who's the next like killer on this team? Who's the guy who's going to be the Robin to Sidney Crosby's Batman? And they have a bunch of good complementary guys. I just don't know if they have that true number two on this team. And when you're getting into these kind of top half of the league teams, they all kind of have them, right? Like they all kind of have that secondary and even like third guy who's like a superstar. And I feel like Pittsburgh is just kind of on the fringes of that, at least offensively, because they don't have that guy at the moment. And maybe somebody emerges, right? But they do, however, have a defensive core that has that kind of secondary offensive weapon, or at least should have that secondary offensive weapon. And that's Erik Karlsson. Now, this defense I've ranked ninth. Um, and I'm going to explain the Erik Karlsson thing for a second because I know I'm going to get pushback on the A for Erik Karlsson. And I get it, right? He had a down year last year, but he had a down year points wise, let's say last year. His underlying numbers were still Erik Karlsson level, right? Like his expected goals numbers were still fantastic. He's one of the best defensemen in the league in terms of that. And over the last two seasons, he's fifth in offensive goals above replacement for defensemen. Like Erik Karlsson is still one of the best offensive defensemen in hockey. Like he's in that top 6, 7 at worst for offensive defensemen. And his point totals took a dip last year. I had concerns last year about him finding a proper role on this team because of Chris Letang being there. And that kind of was the case. He didn't seem to fit as well instantly as this team probably would have hoped. And the hope is that this summer they've been able to kind of figure out how to utilize him better. And, hopefully you can get an Erik Karlsson that's going to be close to a point of game player again. And if they can do that, then not having the secondary option up front isn't as much of an issue anymore because you have that secondary offensive weapon on the back end. I don't like, obviously we've seen, a slight decline in what Erik Karlsson is, despite the fact he had a 100-point season, like I guess 2 years ago now. But his underlying numbers have still been elite, even through that whole San Jose thing when everybody said, oh, he's declining. It's like, well, not really. Like his point totals took a dip through the San Jose debacle, whatever that was, right? The rebuild. But his play driving numbers were always still elite. His expected goals numbers were always still elite. His goals of replacement numbers offensively were still elite. So people talk about the decline of Erik Karlsson, and yes, in a sense, his point totals have taken a dip, and his defensive ability, whatever it was previous, has taken a hit. But the main skill for Erik Karlsson is still there, and it always has been there. And that's kind of what I'm banking the A on right now, right? That's what I'm basing the A on, is the fact that he's still a top 5 to 7 offensive defenseman in the NHL. And unless he has another drop off year this year, I'm going to stay confident in that. But again, like the rankings aren't predictions. They're based on what defenseman has done based on the last, 3 years of evidence for Erik Karlsson. He deserves to be an A defenseman. Chris Letang is the other one. Chris Letang, I feel like is super underrated at this point. He's been healthy the last couple of years. He's looked like, a number one defenseman the last couple of years, maybe on the lower end of number one defenseman. That's why he's an A minus. But again, you're talking about a guy who's aging, right? Like it's in similar way to like an Evgeny Malkin aging. You're still seeing a defenseman who's been, I don't want to say declining because I don't think it's been a steep drop off for Letang yet, but it's somebody that you're just kind of waiting for that fall. And I feel like that's kind of the feeling around this Penguins team is it's a ticking time bomb waiting for all these guys to just like implode, right? Because Erik Karlsson's getting up there in age, Chris Letang's getting up there in age, Crosby, Malkin, right? Like their big four are all hovering around the edge of that cliff. That's Father Time's getting ready to push them off. So it's very volatile in that sense. But again, based on what he's shown over the last couple of years, Chris Letang still deserves to be talked about as one of the top end defensemen in the NHL. As for the rest of this blue line, Marcus Pettersson's somebody I really like. I think he's super underrated as a good complimentary guy. Same with Ryan Graves, similar type player, just worse, but kind of fits that uh, good role kind of player who can play well, kind of cover up somebody's mistakes. At the bottom end of this, I mean, Jack St. Ivory is somebody who's shown flashes of being a solid defenseman. He just needs more playing time. And Matt Grizzlick, who I talked about kind of in the preview video, is somebody that is good shutdown third pair defenseman. He's going to add some physicality to the game. Somebody fans are going to really like. The middle aged dads who yell at their TV are really going to like him because he's going to add that tough edge to his game, and he'll be fine. In the actual analysis of his play, he'll be fine for that role. Moving into the goaltending, I have this tandem in 10th, and Tristan Jarry, very similar to Jordan Binnington, right? Go watch my Jordan Binnington video. Inconsistency has been an issue for him, but when he's hot, he's one of the best goalies in the NHL. It's just finding that consistency. That's kind of the A- tier at this point. Like I said in my St. Louis video, there's not a whole lot of goalies that are really better than that like at that level that are consistent, right? Like peak of his powers, Tristan Jarry is a top 10 goalie in the NHL. It's just finding that consistency, right? And there's very few goalies who are at their peak better than that. Obviously, if you're top 10, right, there's 9 other goalies that are better than that. And it's just about those goalies maybe being more consistent as well. So for me, Tristan Jarry has been fine. People who have been wrongfully hating on him, I think are I don't know, not Penguins fans maybe. But at least like it is all his numbers have been very solid over the last couple of years. He deserves to be an A- tier. I don't think he'll move up anytime soon because I don't see that consistency coming to his game like imminently. I think he's kind of is who he is at this point. Alex Nedeljkovic kind of is the interesting one. Really bad year in Detroit 2 years ago. Fine season last year. I think he hovered around like a 0 goal saved above expected last season, which is better than like the -6 that he had in Detroit. So C- is kind of the best I could do for him. Obviously, it was a bounce back year. I would have had him in a D probably last year. So he moved up a tier based on what I would have had him at last season. Overall, I think it's a good tandem. Like it was a good tandem last year. I don't see that changing much. It for me, it's more just can Pittsburgh find consistency, right? Like can they? It's everywhere, right? Like in net, we just talked about Tristan Jarry having those consistency issues, but it's more so just the team in general, right? It's a team that's always had pretty good underlying numbers. Their expected goals numbers have always been pretty good, but it's just being able to translate that into actual goals, into actual production. Same with defensively, right? Like they've been, a good enough expected goals against team, but it's just about actually making sure those pucks don't go in the net. If this team can figure that out, then yeah, I think they're a playoff team. And that's kind of my biggest question mark for this team is can they actually translate their underlying numbers into actual production? If they can, this team's in the playoffs. If they can't, it's gonna be another season where they're kind of hovering around that fringe spot and just waiting until Sidney Crosby retires so they can rebuild this team. But yeah, let me know what you think of the Pittsburgh Penguins. That is my breakdown on them. And we're getting there. We got 13 teams left. 13 teams left, I think. We're getting there. Season starting right away. Obviously, prospect camps are on right now. Preseason starts I think next week. So it's an exciting time. Hockey's back. And let me know what you think of the Pittsburgh Penguins down below. And we'll see you in the next one. Make sure you like and subscribe. And don't miss the rest of the series. Thanks for watching.